Judge sides with racist cops in court until the black man reveals he's a U.S. attorney. The night air in Baton Rouge was thick with humidity, clinging to Elliot Carter's skin as he eased his car down the nearly deserted highway. He had spent the evening at a dinner with colleagues. Nothing fancy, just a gathering of fellow attorneys discussing cases, life, and everything in between. His thoughts weren't on work as he drove, nor on the courtroom battles he fought daily. For once, his mind was on something simple: home, a shower, and maybe a glass of bourbon before calling it a night. But as soon as the red and blue lights flickered in his rearview mirror, all sense of normalcy vanished. He exhaled sharply, signaling and pulling to the side of the road. He hadn't been speeding. He hadn't run a light. There was no reason for this stop. But Elliot knew better than to assume reason had anything to do with it. The officers approached quickly, their boots crunching against the pavement, their body language already exuding authority before a single word was spoken. Officer Mark Reynolds took the lead, his broad frame and military-cut hair making him look more like a drill sergeant than a street cop. His partner, Officer Adam Whitman, flanked the passenger side, his leaner build no less intimidating as he hovered near the door. Reynolds rapped his knuckles against the window, making Elliot sigh. He rolled it down, already retrieving his license and registration. "License and registration," Reynolds said, his tone clipped and impatient. Elliot handed over the documents without hesitation. "May I ask why I was stopped, officer?" Reynolds exchanged a glance with Whitman before answering. "Your taillight's out." Elliot frowned slightly. That was a lie. His car had just passed inspection the week before. A glance in his rearview mirror confirmed it. The reflection from a nearby store window showed both tail lights glowing red. He had seen this tactic before, heard about it from defendants in cases he'd prosecuted. A fabricated reason to justify a stop. "Are you sure about that?" Elliot asked, keeping his voice level. Reynolds' expression hardened. "Step out of the vehicle." A slow, simmering tension settled in Elliot's chest. This was escalating fast, too fast. He had spent years studying the law, enforcing it, defending it, and he knew he didn't have to comply without probable cause. "I'm not stepping out until you tell me why." A smirk tugged at Whitman's lips. He rested a hand on his belt. "Because we said so." Elliot took a slow breath. He wasn't afraid, but he was angry. He could already see where this was going. The demand, the force, the moment of resistance twisted into justification. It was a game, a setup, and these officers thought they had already won. Reynolds didn't wait for further argument. He yanked the door open, grabbing Elliot's wrist in a vice grip and pulling him forward. The seatbelt snapped tight against Elliot's chest, pain shooting through his shoulder. "What the hell are you doing?" Elliot barked, instinctively pulling back. "Stop resisting," Reynolds shot back coldly. Whitman moved in fast, wrenching Elliot's other arm behind his back, twisting it into an unnatural angle. A sharp sting of metal cuffs clamped against his skin. Elliot gritted his teeth as they pressed him against the hood of his own car. His heart pounded, not with fear, but with fury. These officers thought they had the upper hand. They thought he was just another nameless man. Another arrest they could chalk up without consequence. But they were about to find out just how wrong they were. The courtroom in East Baton Rouge Parish Courthouse buzzed with the murmurs of an audience that had no idea they were about to witness something unforgettable. Elliot Carter sat at the defense table, his posture rigid yet composed. He had spent years in courtrooms, but today he wasn't the prosecutor, he was the defendant. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had built a career ensuring that justice was served, only to find himself fighting against a system that had turned on him in an instant. The charges, resisting arrest, obstruction, disorderly conduct, were fabricated, a carefully crafted lie designed to cover up the wrongful stop and brutal arrest he had endured just days prior. The officers who had thrown him against the hood of his car sat smugly at the witness stand, confident that their word, their badges, and the unwritten rules of the system would protect them. But they had no idea what was coming. Judge Margaret Holloway, a stern woman in her 60s with a reputation for upholding the status quo, barely spared Elliot a glance as she shuffled through papers. She was the type who prioritized efficiency over fairness, and from the way she carried herself, Elliot already knew she wasn't inclined to hear his side. Across the courtroom, Richard Calloway, the state prosecutor, straightened his tie and cast a knowing glance at the officers. This was routine for them. Another day, another case, they would win on muscle memory alone. "Your Honor," Calloway began, his voice dripping with the confidence of someone who believed they had already won. "This is a simple case." The defendant escalated a routine traffic stop into a confrontation, forcing officers to restrain him for their own safety. Elliot exhaled slowly, forcing himself to remain calm as he listened to the blatant distortion of the truth. His lawyer, Thomas Rivera, a public defender with far too many cases and far too little time, shot up from his chair. "Objection. There is zero evidence that my client was aggressive." Judge Holloway barely looked up. Overruled. Elliot's jaw tightened. That was fast. Rivera sighed, already sensing the uphill battle ahead. "Your Honor, the officers escalated the situation without cause. There's no body cam footage showing my client acting aggressively because..." Calloway smirked. "Because the body cams weren't operational at the time of the arrest." Convenient. Officer Mark Reynolds took the stand first, delivering his rehearsed testimony with ease. The defendant was combative from the start, he said smoothly. Refused to exit the vehicle, raised his voice, created a hostile situation. "Lies. Every word." Officer Adam Whitman followed, nodding along as he added, "We feared for our safety. We had no choice but to restrain him." Elliot clenched his fists beneath the table. He had spent his entire career fighting against this kind of corruption, and now he was living it firsthand. Judge Holloway barely concealed her impatience as she turned to Rivera. "Anything else, Counselor?" Rivera hesitated. He knew the judge, knew her track record, but he had no choice. "Yes, Your Honor. The defense calls Elliot Carter to the stand." Elliot stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked to the witness stand, feeling every pair of eyes locked onto him. The weight of the moment was heavy, but he was ready, because what was about to happen would change everything. Elliot Carter took his seat at the witness stand, his hands resting lightly on the wooden surface before him. His heart pounded, but his face remained calm, controlled. He had spent years in courtrooms, but never like this. He wasn't the prosecutor today. He was the accused. Across from him, Richard Calloway, the state prosecutor, straightened his jacket and smirked as he approached, exuding confidence. "Mr. Carter," Calloway began, pacing slightly, "would you say you complied with the officer's instructions during your traffic stop?" Elliot met his gaze evenly. "I asked why I was being ordered out of my car. That is not illegal." Calloway sighed dramatically. "So you refused to exit?" "I asked why," Elliot repeated, his tone unwavering, "which legally I have the right to do." Calloway smirked, glancing at the jury as if Elliot's knowledge of the law was an inconvenience. "And after multiple orders, you still didn't comply?" "Because there was no lawful reason to." The air in the courtroom tightened. Calloway shook his head and turned to the judge as if to say, "See what I'm dealing with here?" But Elliot wasn't done. Before Calloway could continue, Elliot leaned forward slightly. "Before we go any further," he said, his voice cutting through the tension, "I should probably disclose something." The room went still. Calloway hesitated. Even Judge Holloway looked up, fully meeting Elliot's gaze for the first time. Elliot reached into his briefcase, his movements slow, deliberate. His lawyer, Thomas Rivera, tensed beside him, unsure of what was happening. Elliot pulled out a small rectangular badge and placed it on the witness stand. The gold lettering gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights. "I'm Elliot Carter," he said, his voice steady, "Assistant U.S. Attorney for the Southern District." The silence that followed was deafening. Judge Holloway's lips parted slightly, her gavel hovering over her desk, unmoving. The officers stiffened. Calloway's face went pale. Excuse me?" Calloway stammered. Elliot tilted his head. "Did I stutter?" The weight of his words pressed down on the room. The jury leaned forward. The stenographer hesitated before continuing to type. Even Rivera looked like he had just been hit by a freight train. "You're a federal prosecutor?" Calloway's voice wavered slightly. Elliot lifted his ID. That's what this says, doesn't it? And just like that, the entire case imploded. Judge Holloway sat back in her chair, her mouth pressing into a thin line. She knew if she ruled against Elliot now, if she dismissed his testimony and sided with the officers, this wouldn't just be another forgotten case. It would be a scandal. Elliot sat back, watching the silent panic unfold. He had seen this play out before, in back offices, in hushed meetings between prosecutors when the wrong kind of case landed on their desks. But this time, he was the one forcing their hand. The courtroom wasn't just a courtroom anymore. It was a powder keg, and Elliot had just lit the fuse. The courtroom in East Baton Rouge Parish Courthouse was packed. Spectators whispered in hushed voices, the air thick with tension as they watched the unfolding drama. Judge Margaret Holloway sat high on the bench, her expression as unreadable as ever. The weight of what had just happened, the revelation of Elliot Carter's true identity, hung in the air like an approaching storm. Prosecutor Richard Calloway adjusted his tie, his movements stiffer than before. He had walked into this case expecting a routine conviction, another nameless face in the system. Instead, he had walked into a disaster. And now, as he glanced at Officers Reynolds and Whitman, their confident smirks gone, he realized they had all drastically underestimated their opponent. Elliot Carter sat at the witness stand, composed despite the firestorm around him. His ID badge still lay on the wooden surface before him, a symbol of everything the prosecution had failed to anticipate. Calloway exhaled slowly, then turned to address the judge. "Your Honor," he said, his voice measured but forced, "with all due respect, Mr. Carter's profession doesn't change the fact that he resisted arrest." Elliot leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but razor-sharp. "It changes everything, Counselor. It highlights how easily your officers fabricated a case against me because they assumed I was just another man who wouldn't fight back. I know the law, and I know my rights. And still, they dragged me out of my car, slammed me against my own hood, and charged me with crimes that never happened." Judge Holloway pressed her lips into a thin line. The weight of the moment was undeniable. This was no longer a simple case, it was an indictment of the entire system. The public was watching. The media was watching. Every decision she made from this point forward would have consequences beyond this courtroom. Calloway cleared his throat and turned back to Elliot. "So, you claim this was a wrongful arrest?" Elliot didn't blink. "I don't claim anything. I state it as fact." Silence stretched. Then Elliot turned toward Reynolds and Whitman, who sat stiffly at the prosecution's table. "Tell me, officers," Elliot said, his voice laced with quiet authority. "Would you like to amend your statements?" Reynolds' jaw twitched. Whitman's knee bounced under the table. The pressure was suffocating. Calloway, sensing the unraveling of his case, jumped in. "Your Honor, we're prepared to argue that," Elliot cut him off, turning back to the judge. "Your Honor, I request that the court pull the dispatch call logs from the night of my arrest." Calloway flinched. Elliot wasn't guessing. He knew how these things worked. If the officers had radioed in before the stop, their excuse about the broken taillight wouldn't hold. If they hadn't, then their entire justification for pulling him over fell apart. Judge Holloway studied him for a long moment, the gavel in her hand suddenly feeling much heavier. She was trapped. If she denied his request, she was burying evidence. If she granted it, she was handing Elliot the final nail in the coffin. She cleared her throat. "Request granted." Reynolds exhaled sharply. Whitman's composure cracked, his hands clenched tightly into fists. They knew what was coming. The courtroom buzzed. Reporters scribbled furiously. The gallery murmured in disbelief. Elliot leaned back in his chair, but he wasn't finished yet. Because this wasn't just about proving his innocence. This was about dismantling the system that allowed this to happen in the first place. As the courtroom buzzed with tension, Officer Reynolds shifted in his seat, his once confident demeanor eroding under the weight of what had just transpired. His hands clenched the edge of the table, as if trying to grip onto what little control he had left. Officer Whitman, his usual arrogance replaced with a nervous energy, cast a desperate glance at Prosecutor Calloway. But Calloway was of no help now. His carefully orchestrated case had unraveled the moment Elliot Carter had pulled out his badge. Judge Holloway took a deep breath, her fingers tapping the bench in a slow, deliberate rhythm. "Officers Reynolds and Whitman," she said, her tone heavy with warning, "would you like to amend your statements?" The room fell silent, all eyes locked onto the two officers. Reynolds's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. His mind was racing. There had to be a way out, some loophole, some excuse that could salvage this disaster. But there wasn't. They had lied, and now the world knew it. Whitman was the first to crack. His voice was barely above a whisper. We may have made an error in judgment." Calloway stiffened. "Officer Whitman, be careful with your words." But it was too late. The damage had been done. Elliot Carter leaned forward, his voice steady. "An error in judgment?" His tone carried no anger, only the weight of something much heavier, truth. "You didn't make an error. You falsified the reason for the stop, escalated the situation without cause, and then fabricated charges to justify your actions. That's not a mistake, Officer Whitman. That's a crime." Murmurs spread across the courtroom. The stenographer hesitated before resuming her typing. Reporters in the gallery scribbled furiously, knowing they were witnessing a moment that would shake the system. Reynolds finally spoke, his voice edged with panic. "We were following procedure." Elliot's gaze locked onto him. "If what you did to me was procedure, then maybe we need to start questioning what that procedure truly is." Judge Holloway's patience was thinning. She turned to Calloway, her expression sharp. "Mr. Calloway, does the prosecution have anything further to add?" Calloway hesitated, his career flashing before his eyes. He had walked into this case confident that it would be another easy conviction, another name checked off his list. Now he was staring at a complete and total disaster. "Your Honor," he finally said, his voice quieter than before, "the prosecution has no further statements at this time." Elliot sat back, satisfied. But he wasn't done. "Your Honor," he said, turning to Judge Holloway, "this is bigger than me. If officers like these can so easily manipulate the system against someone with my credentials, imagine what happens to those without a law degree, without connections, without the ability to fight back." The weight of his words settled in the room like a thick fog. Even Judge Holloway, who had spent years dismissing cases just like this, knew there was no easy way out of this one. Finally, after a long, heavy pause, she set down her gavel and spoke. "I will be forwarding this case to the state attorney's office for further review." And just like that, the tides had turned. Elliot Carter had spent years watching the justice system protect its own, shielding corrupt officers and prosecutors under layers of bureaucracy and silence. But this time, the silence was broken. His case had gone public, exploding across headlines, social media, and television screens. What had started as a routine traffic stop had become a national scandal, and the city of Baton Rouge found itself at the center of a reckoning. It began with a single article. The young journalist from the Baton Rouge Advocate had sat quietly in the back of the courtroom, typing feverishly as the events unfolded. By the time Elliot walked out of that courtroom, the article was already live, and within hours, it had gone viral. Federal prosecutor arrested on false charges, exposes police misconduct in open court. That headline was just the beginning. By the next morning, news stations across the country picked up the story. Civil rights groups issued statements, condemning the blatant abuse of power. Lawyers and former judges took to interviews, dissecting every legal misstep that had led to Elliot being dragged out of his own car. The footage from inside the courtroom, secretly recorded by an attendee, spread like wildfire. The video was damning. Elliot's calm revelation of his badge, the panic in Officer Reynolds' face, the stunned silence of Prosecutor Calloway, and finally Judge Holloway's reluctant acknowledgement that something had gone terribly wrong. The internet dissected every frame, every nervous glance, every shift in body language. The pressure mounted fast. The mayor held an emergency press conference, calling for an immediate review of police procedures. The police chief, who had remained silent for the first 24 hours, finally issued a statement. "We take these allegations seriously and will cooperate fully with the investigation." But the public wasn't buying it. Within days, protesters gathered outside the courthouse, demanding action. Signs reading, "Justice for all, not just the powerful," filled the streets. Activists didn't just call for the suspension of Officers Reynolds and Whitman. They wanted systemic change. But the real blow came when an anonymous source leaked internal police records. The documents revealed a disturbing pattern. Dozens of cases where black men had been stopped under vague justifications, just like Elliot. The public outrage turned into something far bigger than just one man's wrongful arrest. Elliot sat in his office late at night, scrolling through the endless news coverage. He had fought cases like this for years, but this time he wasn't just arguing in court. He had become the case itself. The system had been forced to face the truth. But Elliot knew this was just the beginning. As his phone buzzed with calls from reporters, lawyers, and community leaders, one thought settled deep in his chest. They wanted to silence him, but instead, they had amplified the very message they feared most. The case may have been won in court, but Elliot Carter knew the battle for justice was far from over. His wrongful arrest had become a rallying cry, igniting protests, debates, and national outrage. But Elliot didn't just want temporary outrage. He wanted real change. And he knew that wouldn't happen in a single day, a single trial, or a single headline. It would take more. The weeks following the verdict were filled with chaos. The mayor's office announced sweeping reforms, promising improved police training and stricter oversight. The police chief resigned under mounting pressure, replaced by someone vowing to clean house. Officers Reynolds and Whitman were placed on administrative leave, pending an internal investigation. Judge Holloway, whose dismissive rulings had long been an open secret, suddenly faced judicial review. But Elliot had seen these political maneuvers before. He knew how easily promises could be made and forgotten. So, instead of celebrating, he got to work. He met with civil rights lawyers, activists, and lawmakers, anyone willing to turn this moment into meaningful reform. He testified before city officials, demanding legislation that would hold officers accountable for false arrests. He helped draft new policies requiring officers to justify stops with verifiable evidence, not just vague descriptions. Yet, as much as the system tried to repair its image, there was one thing it couldn't erase: the stories of those who had been silenced before Elliot. His inbox was flooded with emails from people who had lived through the same nightmare, but never had the platform to fight back. Fathers, sons, and community leaders, all wrongfully stopped, humiliated, and arrested, their names never making the news. Elliot refused to let their stories fade. He started working with journalists to uncover past cases of misconduct, ensuring that what had happened to him wouldn't be treated as an isolated incident. He knew his position as a federal prosecutor gave him privilege, his career, his reputation, his ability to fight back. But that privilege meant responsibility. If the system had been forced to listen to him, he would make sure they heard the voices of those who had been ignored. As he sat in yet another meeting, drafting legal strategies for reform, a journalist asked him if he felt like he had won. Elliot took a deep breath before answering. "Justice isn't a victory, it's a responsibility, and I'm not done yet." Elliot Carter's case had started as a personal fight, but it quickly became something much bigger. His wrongful arrest and public revelation in the courtroom had exposed more than just two corrupt officers. It had cracked open an entire system that had thrived on silence and unchecked power. The fallout was swift and relentless. National media outlets picked up his story, replaying the moment he revealed his badge as a federal prosecutor in court. Social media erupted, turning his case into a symbol of the deep flaws within the justice system. Protests swelled beyond Baton Rouge, with activists in cities across the country demanding accountability for police misconduct. Community leaders who had spent years pushing for reform now had the public's attention in a way they never had before. Elliot's story had become fuel for something much bigger than him. But with the spotlight came resistance. Law enforcement unions scrambled to defend Reynolds and Whitman, arguing that they had acted in good faith. Conservative commentators accused Elliot of playing the victim, downplaying the racial bias at the heart of his case. The system was fighting back, desperate to control the narrative before it spiraled further. But it was too late. The truth was already out. Elliot refused to let the momentum die. He partnered with civil rights organizations to investigate past wrongful arrests, uncovering years of patterns that showed how many innocent people had been swept into the system with no way to fight back. He used his legal expertise to advocate for reforms, pushing for new laws that would make it harder for officers to justify baseless stops and easier for victims of misconduct to seek justice. This wasn't about revenge. It was about making sure the next person in his position didn't have to rely on status or luck to walk free. Elliot knew his fight wasn't over, but now he wasn't fighting alone. Months after Elliot Carter's case shook the justice system, the impact continued to ripple through Baton Rouge and beyond. His wrongful arrest had sparked investigations, led to policy changes, and forced the city's police department to overhaul its training programs. Officers were now required to undergo extensive de-escalation and implicit bias training, and new oversight measures ensured that misconduct couldn't be easily swept under the rug. But Elliot knew policies alone wouldn't change the culture. He dedicated his time to speaking at law schools, police academies, and community forums, sharing his experience and urging others to push for accountability. He worked with legislators to draft reforms that would protect citizens from racial profiling and unjustified stops. One evening, after finishing a panel discussion, a young law student approached him, eyes filled with determination. "Your case is why I want to become a prosecutor," she said, "not to put people away, but to make sure the system works for everyone." Elliot smiled. He had started this fight alone, but now the next generation was ready to carry it forward. Justice wasn't just a case to win, it was a legacy to build, one step at a time.